Welcome to our discussion. Today we're diving into some transformative legislative reforms that have reshaped how India manages its Waqf properties, specifically looking at how the 2025 Amendment Bill rectifies issues from the 1995 Act. Absolutely, there's a lot to unpack here. What really stands out to you from these reforms? Well, first off, it's the fundamental change to the arbitrary powers that were once granted by Section 40 of the 1995 Act. This section, as we know, effectively allowed Waqf boards to unilaterally designate any land as Waqf property. Right, that unilateral decision-making created some serious issues around property rights. I find it really striking how such unchecked authority led to widespread encroachment on lands, including precious temple properties. Exactly, and it wasn't just temple lands. This mechanism affected various communities. The lack of independent verification meant that the boards could just claim properties without proper oversight. Yep, that's a major breach of natural justice, isn't it? It left aggrieved parties with almost no recourse since the inquiries were entirely internal. Yeah, it's like giving someone the keys to the kingdom without any checks. Everything was controlled by just one group. And remember, under the 1995 Act, women and non-Muslims were completely excluded from the Waqf boards. It almost felt like a monopoly, with one section dictating the entire process. But with this reform, they've mandated 2 women and 2 non-Muslim representatives, which is pretty progressive. Right. Exactly. It's a step towards making the system more inclusive. I mean, when you're dealing with vast public assets, like those 872,000 properties over 405,000 hectares, roughly 1 million acres, there's no room for biased management. And those asset values are staggering, around $22 billion. Clearly, the management of these properties could not remain opaque any longer. Absolutely. And another key change is to the so-called Waqf by user doctrine. Previously, long-term use without formal documentation automatically converted properties into Waqf lands. It's like saying if you hang out long enough in a cafe, you own it. That analogy really hits home. Without proper documentation, it was so easy to misappropriate properties. With the Amendment Bill nullifying this doctrine for future properties, there's now a demand for formal proof of ownership, which is much fairer. Correct, and that also ties into improved judicial review. Previously, decisions by the Waqf Tribunal were final, and there was a whole parallel legal structure without recourse. Now, the new bill allows appeals in revenue, civil, and even high courts, which really integrates these cases into the mainstream judicial system. I mean, having a mechanism where real citizens can challenge decisions in multiple courts is a huge win for justice. It's almost like leveling the playing field for everyone involved. Exactly, leveling the playing field. And that also brings transparency into focus. The Amendment Bill mandates that all Waqf properties be registered on a central portal within 6 months, while also introducing annual audits for institutions earning over 1 lakh rupees. Transparency is such a critical aspect here. Without central records and regular audits, corruption really thrived under the old system, especially considering how often these properties were managed with minimal oversight. Yes, and let's not forget the strategic renaming of the bill to UMEED, Unified Management, Empowerment, Efficiency, and Development. This rebranding clearly signals a shift from purely religious connotations to a focus on broader development and efficiency. The rebranding itself sends a powerful message about the intent to be more inclusive and pragmatic. But if I may challenge this point a bit, do you think this shift in nomenclature might mask some underlying controversies? Or is it genuinely a sign of reform? That's a good question. I think there's always a risk of political rebranding, but here, the substance of the reforms, abolishing Section 40 and overhauling judicial review, speaks louder than the name. And The fact that these changes also reduce the mandatory contributions from 7% to 5% isn't just cosmetic, it eases the financial burden on legitimate institutions. Right. Lessening the financial strain while ensuring proper accountability seems like a balanced approach. But, some critics argue that these reforms might end up marginalizing certain communities who benefited from the old system. How would you respond to that? I get that concern, but when you look at the data, reforms like including non-Muslim members and protecting temple and heritage sites clearly address historical exploitation. The previous system led to over 14,000 litigations involving disputed claims on temple lands and other properties. The new system aims to prevent future encroachments by mandating proper documentation and oversight. Right. True, it seems like a necessary reset to correct decades of imbalances. These changes, especially in judicial oversight, are bound to foster more accountability. And don't overlook the specific safeguards for tribal lands. By prohibiting Waqf claims on Schedule FI and VI lands, the bill shields vulnerable communities from exploitation. It's, like putting up a strong fence around already marginalized territories. That's a great analogy. Protecting tribal lands is essential, and it really showcases the bill's intent to balance diverse community interests. Absolutely, and this is where the momentum of the bill in the Lok Sabha is noteworthy. With 288 votes in favor, even amid opposition that frankly used anti-reform rhetoric, it demonstrates a broad base of support for rebalancing property rights. And what's interesting is that even non-Muslim religious organizations, like the Kerala Catholic Bishops' Council, backed the reforms. That cross-community support emphasizes the need for change, right? Because when actions affect vast public assets and national heritage, over 280 ASI monuments, for instance, you can't have a system that's inherently biased in one direction. Yep. It's fascinating how legacy issues from the 1995 Act, like the unchecked land grabs, I recall it mentioned properties were added at a staggering rate compared to historical acquisitions, have now been seen in a new light. Exactly. The old mechanism was so prone to abuse. Land grabs that expanded Waqf holdings by 21 lakh acres in just 12 years compared to 18 lakh acres in a century. That's astronomical. Wow, those numbers definitely put things into perspective. It clearly demonstrates the urgency behind the reforms. And the inclusion of measures for timely resolution of disputes using the Limitation Act 1963 ensures that endless litigation isn't a tool for obfuscation anymore. This reform really integrates Waqf disputes back into mainstream legal processes. It's almost like cleaning up an old filing cabinet that was so full of unchecked files you couldn't find a proper record. With centralized registration and proper audits, accountability is bound to improve. Exactly. And this accountability isn't just about financial transparency, it's also about upholding the rights of women and children. Under the 1995 framework, inheritance claims were almost ignored when properties were designated as Waqf. Now, those rights are explicitly prioritized. That, to me, is a huge win. Ensuring that widows, orphans, and divorced women receive their rightful inheritances before any declaration of Waqf is a shift towards more equitable property management. And let's not forget about protecting historical and sacred sites. By excluding ASI monument sites from Waqf jurisdiction, the Amendment Bill helps secure the cultural legacy of India, preventing potential encroachments on heritage sites like Qutub Minar and others. Right. Safeguarding our heritage was long overdue. Now, it's not just about property rights in isolation, it's also about preserving the identity and history of diverse communities. Exactly. It's clear then that these reforms, while challenging some of the entrenched powers of traditional Waqf boards, represent a civilizational victory, a restoration of balance and fairness in managing public assets that affect all communities. I agree, and even though some argue that such sweeping reforms might disrupt long-established practices, the changes seem to align with principles of justice and accountability that many, especially in minority communities, have been demanding. Right, it's a bold move, and the leadership behind this amendment, particularly in addressing historical Congress-led missteps, is impressive. The current government has, it seems, finally delivered on promises to protect national heritage while ensuring equitable governance. Yep. So, in the end, while the road to reform was fraught with criticism and challenges, the 2025 Amendment Bill ushers in a much-needed era of transparency, balanced governance, and ultimately, justice for all.